Welcome to the program, and I can't think of a better week in which to have you, because there's just been so much that everybody's trying to process and figure out how to define. And so I was fascinated by what you wrote in the New York Times. And sort of you start by saying, how did a peak about, fit of pique about China and tolls lead to upending a long-resolved territorial issue about control and a threat to force Panama into ceding territory to the U.S.? And you ask, was there some larger rationale to explain it? So I'm now asking you to answer your own question.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd have to say that it was difficult for me at first to come up with a rationale. I'd been working on a project studying grassroots right-wing Americans in history and their interest in U.S. foreign policy. And if anyone should have known, I should have known what was going on with all of the different claims that Trump was making. But the truth is, it took me a while to figure it out. As we know, and especially close watchers of Trump can tell us, he's quite changeable. He himself may not have a clear ideology, but those around him, those who support him in Congress, his policy advisors, and many of those who elected him do, in fact, have an ideology. And when I started to see him talk about the Panama Canal, that's when it clicked for me that what I was seeing actually was an invocation of this long tradition of suspicion about internationalism, organized around protecting national sovereignty. And the Panama Canal was one of those places that had long been of interest to them.
So, again, there are all sorts of isms that conservatives have had, whether it's anti-communism, whether it's nationalism, often populism, although that can be left-wing as well, imperialism, isolationism, and you come up with this word sovereigntism. And as you say, the Panama Canal debate sort of settled you there. So take us back then to that. And why that? Why was the Panama Canal ever such a big issue?
So to understand what's happening with the Panama Canal, you do have to go back to that earlier period, that 1919 period that you talked about. And it's they themselves who use the word sovereignty. It's they themselves who call themselves sovereigntist anti-internationalists. And I think that in looking back to that period, you see the beginning of a kind of questioning in the wake of World War I about what is a state? What is sovereignty? What does it mean in a period when globalism had come to a halt because of the war? New nations were being created with new nationalisms. Empires were dying. And now here comes this idea that on top of all of this, we will have an international government. And that is really where I think the concerns began for them. What would it mean to have some kind of limitation, some kind of interference in the jurisdiction, in the governance of American, people and also territory? So the canal becomes an issue after World War II, when a new international body, of course, is created, none other than the UN. And very soon after the creation of the UN, all kinds of nations which had either been under imperial control or were wishing to get out from under imperial control are using this new body and the promise of the United Nations to seek self-governance. Panama is among them, and very early on starts to ask if the Panama Canal can be taken up in the United Nations as essentially a kind of disputed territory, and pressing to have that territory returned, in fact, to the country of Panama.
And then you tell this incredible anecdote about the then president of Panama in the 70s bringing the United Nations Security Council members to Panama and saying, quote, calling it a colony in the heart of my country. It was still under the U.S. control. At the same time, you quote a key American saying that it's ours just as much as the Capitol Dome and our national anthem is ours. So this whole thing, enrages the sovereigntists. And you say it boils down to a battle between those who view international cooperation as a tool to project American power versus those who fear it as a humiliating surrender of American autonomy. Is that where Trump fits in?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that historians like to say is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so there may not be this incredible direct line from that moment in 1973 to today. But what there is the kind of recurring problem of the question of how do people running American foreign policy understand internationalism? Do they understand it as a tool that can be used through which to leverage American authority? I would say the vast majority of leadership in the United States, at least since World War II, has understood institutions like the United Nations, the IMF, later the World Bank, as institutions through which the U.S. can exert its own sovereignty. But I suppose one person's sovereignty is another person's weapon, a weapon being utilized against them. And I think sovereigntists always understood these to be very compromised institutions in which other nations, and nations that they did not believe should be equal to them, were having a say over the things that the U.S. could do and say, hence the Panama Canal. Why should Panamanians be able to request their own territory back when it was, quote unquote, ours, as much as the Capitol Dome?
So, fast forward and you say, well, actually you quote the sort of sovereigntists perhaps in the Project 2025 movement, which has been very key to the sort of structure around the Trump 2.0, basically saying they might withdraw from the UN itself. They say international organizations that erode our constitution, rule of law, or popular sovereignty should not be reformed. They should be abandoned. How far do you think this movement is going to be able to go? Do you think up until coming out of the UN? I mean, for instance, Trump did pull out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and now a like-minded president of Argentina, Milei, who, celebrates Trump's politics, has also done that. Do you see this kind of movement gathering pace?
It does seem like it's gathering pace. I mean, historians are notoriously no good at predicting the future, which we're much better at looking back at the past. But this has been a dream, really, of anti-internationalists since the formation of the United Nations, is to have the U.S. withdraw. There were grassroots campaigns, from the 1950s all the way up, really, on and off through today, asking for the U.S. to withdraw. It's always been, I think, the ultimate goal. And to also withdraw from other internationalist organizations. NATO, for example, has long been suspect among anti-internationalists, as has the WHO and a variety of other ones. I would expect now, in a second Trump administration, for sovereigntists to double down. I would expect for them to look for opportunities to be able to withdraw from these organizations and perhaps to encourage other right-wing governments who are also anti-internationalist or right-wing parties that are anti-internationalist to do the same.